In the summer of 1403, on a field outside Shrewsbury, a 16-year-old boy took an arrow in the face. It entered beside his nose, just under the eye, and stopped when the iron head buried itself in the bone at the back of the socket. 6 inches deep, someone pulled the shaft. The head stayed in his skull. He should have died. Not from the arrow, from everything that comes after an arrow. He didn't. He kept the eye. 12 years later, he was King of England, standing in the mud at Agincourt. The man who did that was not a scholar and not a priest. He was a surgeon named John Bradmore, and the account of what he did is written in his own hand. We'll come back to it. But to understand how anyone in that world pulled off something like that, you have to start much lower down. You have to start with a cup of weak beer. Almost every household in England in the 1300s brewed, not for pleasure, and not because water was poison. People drank water. They judged wells and springs by taste and smell, and they were not stupid about it. Beer was something else. Beer was how you stopped grain from spoiling in a damp climate and turned it into something you could store as liquid, and it carried real calories. A working man drank a gallon of it a day and got a meaningful share of his food that way, and the part that matters most was accidental. To brew, you boil. Every batch of small ale in that village passed through a rolling boil before anyone drank a drop of it. Nobody in England in 1300 knew what a microorganism was. They knew that this stuff kept a few days, and that the water in the ditch behind the tanner's yard did not. That's the pattern for everything that follows. They got the result right long before anyone could explain it. Hold that thought, because at the end of this I'm going to show you a city that solved a problem. Their own doctors did not understand at all. Now here's the thing nobody tells you about that house. Getting the fire lit was not the skill. Not letting it go out was the skill. At night, the last person awake banked the hearth. You rake the embers into a heap, cover them with a layer of ash deep enough to choke the flame but not the heat, and the coals sit there smouldering under their own blanket until morning. Do it right, and you scrape the ash off at dawn, feed it dry kindling, and you have fire in under a minute. Do it wrong and you spend the coldest hour of the day working flint against steel over a scrap of charred linen with hands that won't close properly. Which is why fire was borrowed. You walked to a neighbor with a clay pot and carried some of theirs home, and in the towns it was law. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire. A bell rang and every hearth in the town got banked, because a wooden town under a thatched roof does not survive one loose ember on a windy night. That's not superstition. That's a fire code. Look up in that house, and there is no chimney. In a peasant cottage across most of this period, there is an open hearth in the middle of the floor and no flue at all. The smoke rises, spreads under the roof, and works its way out through the thatch. Which sounds like something people endured because they had nothing better. They had something better. Chimneys existed. Manor houses had them. The smoke was doing work. It dried the underside of the thatch from below, which is the only thing keeping a wet roof from rotting through in an English winter. It kept insects and vermin out of the roof space, and it laid a hard black crust of soot across the reed that sealed it. We know this because that soot is still there. There are buildings standing in England today with smoke-blackened thatch preserved in the roof, and you can date the crop that grew that straw. The smoke stung. The roof lasted decades. Which brings us to what you're wearing in that room, because the cold in an English February does not care about your roof. Wool. And not wool the way you know it. Raw wool comes off the sheep loaded with lanolin, the grease the animal makes to shed rain, and medieval cloth was not stripped clean the way modern yarn is. Then the woven fabric went through fulling, which means it was pounded in water for hours, sometimes by watermill hammers, until the fibers locked together and the weave closed up into something dense and slightly felted. What comes out of that turns wind. It sheds a light rain. And here's the part that saved lives. When it finally does soak through, it still holds heat. Wet wool keeps warming you. A wet cotton shirt is a cooling device strapped to your chest, and if you are outside in a wet English March in a cotton shirt, you are on a clock. A good cloak was not clothing, it was capital. People named cloaks in their wills and left them to their children by name. And somebody made that cloth by hand, thread by thread, and this is where the numbers stop being comfortable. Spinning was done on a drop spindle, a weighted stick that hangs and turns, with the raw fibre held on a staff called a distaff tucked under one arm, which means it was portable. Women spun while walking to the mill, while watching children, while minding sheep, standing in a doorway talking to a neighbour, hands moving the entire time without looking down. The reason it never stopped is arithmetic. A single wool garment takes miles of spun thread, not yards, miles. The spinning wheel reaches Europe around the 1200s and speeds it up enormously, but the spindle never goes away, because the wheel keeps you sitting in one place, and the spindle goes with you. Every hour a woman was awake and not doing something else with her hands was an hour of thread. That is not a domestic hobby. That is the textile industry of a continent, running on the free time of half the population. Food is where the assumptions really fall over. Start with the myth, because it's the loudest one. Heavy spicing did not exist to hide rotten meat. Pepper and cloves came from the far side of the world and cost accordingly. Nobody spends a month's wages on pepper to disguise a joint of beef they could have salted for almost nothing. Spice on the table meant you could afford spice on the table. That's all it ever meant. The real work was preservation, and it was 4 separate technologies running at once. Salting, which pulls the water out of meat until nothing can grow in it. Smoking, which dries and coats the surface. Drying in wind and sun for fish and fruit. And fermentation, which is the strange one, because fermentation means deliberately letting one thing grow in your food so that nothing else can. Cabbage in brine. Milk turned into cheese. Think about cheese for a second. A cow gives you milk that is useless in 3 days. Cheese is that same milk, sitting on a shelf edible in February. Somebody worked out how to store summer inside a wheel of hard rind and keep a family alive on it through the dark half of the year. They needed all of it, because of something that will not match your idea of when people go hungry. The land ran on a 3-field rotation across much of northern Europe. 1 field in winter grain, 1 field in a spring crop, often beans or peas, 1 field left fallow with the animals turned onto it to graze and manure it. Nobody knew what nitrogen was. Everybody knew that a field that had grown beans came back stronger, and that the field the sheep had stood on came back stronger still, and they built the entire agricultural calendar on those 2 observations. And the hunger did not come in January. Midwinter is fine. Midwinter you have the harvest behind you, and the animals you slaughtered in the autumn, because you couldn't feed them all through the cold. The killing months were March, April, May, into June. The stores are down to the bottom of the barrel, the new crop is in the ground but nowhere near ready, and the work of ploughing and sowing is the hardest physical labor of the entire year. Maximum effort, minimum food. They called it the hungry gap, and it is the season that thinned the villages. That is also the season you eat things you would rather not, and this is where they proved they were paying attention. Rye grows well in cold, wet ground, so northern Europe ate a lot of it. In wet years, rye carries a fungus. Eat enough bread made from that grain, and you get a condition they called St. Anthony's fire, and the name is literal. It starts as a burning in the hands and feet. The blood supply to the limbs shuts down. Fingers and toes go black and dry and die on the living body. Some people convulsed. Some hallucinated so violently that the chronicles describing it read like accounts of mass madness in a village. They could not see a fungus, they had no idea what it was, but they connected it to bad years, to certain grain, to particular bread, and the sick were carried to the hospitals of the Order of St. Anthony, where they were fed on what the house had, which was largely not local rye. People got better. Not because of the shrine, because they had been taken away from the bread now, the boy with the arrow in his skull. The problem Bradmore faced was mechanical. The head was iron, socketed, sitting deep against bone, and the wooden shaft was already gone, so there was nothing to pull. Reaching in and grabbing at it would tear the face apart and almost certainly kill the patient. So he did 2 things. First, he kept the wound channel open and widened it slowly over days, using slender probes wrapped in linen and dressed with honey, each one a little larger than the last, so that the passage stayed clean and stayed accessible instead of closing over the iron. Then he had a tool made specifically for this wound, tongs whose arms could be seated into the hollow socket of that particular arrowhead, and then spread and locked by a screw, so that the grip was on the inside of the head rather than around it. He worked it loose. He drew it out. Then he flushed the wound with wine and dressed it, and the boy healed. Honey and wine are not folk charm. Honey draws water out of bacteria and will not let them grow. Wine is mildly antiseptic. Neither Bradmore nor anyone alive in 1403 could have told you why those worked, and both had been in the wound kits of practicing surgeons for centuries because they had watched what happened when they used them and what happened when they didn't. And I want to be exact here, because this is the point where a channel like this usually starts lying to you. Medieval medicine also killed enormous numbers of people. The theory underneath all of it, the four humours, was wrong from top to bottom, and bloodletting drained the strength out of patients who needed every drop they had for centuries. On the authority of books nobody was permitted to contradict. The split is stark. The university physicians reasoned from ancient texts and were often useless. The surgeons and barber surgeons who worked on battlefields learned from what happened in front of their hands and got shockingly good at wounds, fractures, and amputation. Bradmore was the second kind. Which brings us to war and the things sieges are actually about. A siege is not an assault. A siege is arithmetic. The garrison counts water first, food second, and days third. Cisterns and wells decide everything, because a castle with grain and no water falls in a week. And the attacker has the worst problem. An army sitting still outside a wall is thousands of men living in their own filth beside a river they are also drinking from. Dysentery went through those camps and emptied them. Henry V took Harfleur in 1415 and lost so much of his army to camp sickness that he marched away from the siege with a fraction of the men he arrived with. He went on to fight Agincourt with the survivors. The wall did not do that to him. The latrine did, and in his line stood the weapon everybody thinks they understand. The English longbow was cut from yew in one piece and cut in a specific way. The stave was taken so it kept the pale springy sapwood along the back and the dense heartwood along the belly. The heartwood resists being crushed. The sapwood resists being stretched. One piece of wood, two materials fighting each other, and the fight is what throws the arrow. Now draw weight. Our hard physical evidence comes from the Mary Rose, which sank in 1545, so that is Tudor, not medieval. And I'm not going to pretend those are 14th century bows. It is the best surviving evidence we have. Those bows come out at draw weights estimated from around 100 pounds up past 160. Put that in your hands. Take a heavy adult, hang them off a rope, lift them with 2 fingers and your back, hold it steady, aim and release cleanly, then do it again, 12 times a minute. Nobody does that with training. That is done with a body that was built for it, and the skeletons prove it. The archers recovered from that wreck have thickened, overdeveloped bones in the left arm and shoulder, twisted spines, and bone spurs on the fingers. The work rebuilt the man. They started as boys, because English law ordered them to practice, and it ordered practice because you cannot produce that body in an emergency. You produce it over 15 years. So that is the world. Fire kept alive under ash. Roofs preserved by smoke. Cloth that warms you wet. Summer stored in cheese. A surgeon building a tool for one wound in one face. And then, in 1377, on the Dalmatian coast, the city council of Ragusa, which is Dubrovnik today, wrote down something that had never existed before. Plague had already been through Europe once and killed a share of the population that is genuinely hard to hold in your head. Ragusa was a trading port, which meant its wealth arrived by ship, and so did the disease. So the council passed a law. Anyone coming from a place where plague was active could not enter the city. They had to sit in a designated place away from the town for 30 days, and only then come in. 30 days became 40. In Venetian Italian, 40 is quaranta. That is where the word quarantine comes from, and it is the earliest such law we have. Understand what that is. They had no idea what plague was. No germs, no fleas, no rats, no bacteria, no theory of contagion worth anything at all. Their own physicians were explaining the epidemic with corrupted air and the positions of the planets, and the council looked past all of it and worked out, from watching ships and watching who died afterward, that whatever this thing was, it took a certain amount of time to show itself, and if you held people apart for longer than that time, it did not get in. They solved it without understanding it, wrote it into law, enforced it with penalties, and it worked. That policy is still the backbone of how the world handles an outbreak 650 years later. Here's the part I keep coming back to. Nobody in this video thought they were doing anything remarkable. A 10-year-old in an English village in 1350 could bank a hearth so it lived until morning, spin thread without watching her hands, tell you which grain in the bin had gone wrong, help salt a carcass in November so it fed the house in March, read a sky well enough to know whether the hay came in today or rotted, and knew exactly which months of the year the food would run thin, because she had been hungry in them. That was not expertise, that was being a child there. You would not last the hungry gap. Not one of it. Not the march ploughing on an empty stomach, not the wet, not the fire going out at 3 in the morning with the flint in your hand and your fingers not closing. And they'd have been polite about it. They'd have assumed you were sick.